Hello and welcome back to Kilmainham Gaol for another one of our Kilmainham Gaol on lockdown videos. This is part 5 of our series on the Invincibles, and this particular video is going to involve a lot of discussion about hanging and the mechanics of execution. So if you think that's something that might be a bit too upsetting, maybe best to give this particular video a miss. Now, one of the things I suppose to remember about the execution of the Invincibles in Kilmainham Gaol in 1883 is this was a very unusual event by that time. There hadn't been a hanging in Kilmainham since 1865, and that hanging had taken place in public at the front of the jail. So this was something that most of the staff here probably were completely unfamiliar with. There was also huge public interest, both in the story of the killing of Lord Frederick Cavendish and T.H. Burke, the activities of the Invincibles throughout that year, and of course the sensational trials. So on the day of the execution of the first of the men, Joe Brady, on the 14th of May, a large crowd gathered outside. Some of the papers estimated several thousand. Many of them congregated down at the bridge over the Cammock, because that way they could get a good view up at the east end of the jail where the black flag was raised when the man had been executed. The executions took place about 8 o'clock in the morning. And they were carried out by a man called William Marwood, as I mentioned in the previous video. He came over from England. Apparently the evening before the execution of Joe Brady, he tried to go for a stroll with some of the guards just around the area, and somewhere near the South Circular Road they met an angry crowd of Dublin natives, and they decided it might be safer for him to spend the rest of his time in Dublin within the safety of the walls of Kilmainham Gaol. And he was here for nearly a month, as you'll see on this plaque here. This plaque was erected by the Kilmainham Gaol Restoration Society, probably one of the first plaques that they erected, and it commemorates the fact that not only were the men hanged here, but they were also buried in Kilmainham Gaol. As I said, this was a very, very new experience in the life of Kilmainham Gaol. They hadn't done a private execution before, so as a result they had to build a new scaffold, and that was built down in this yard just down below us in the southwest corner of Kilmainham Gaol. According to Ty Hopkins, who wrote about the Invincibles in the 1890s, the scaffold was built by the Royal Engineers Regiment of the Army, and they had to essentially smuggle the wood into Kilmainham because they were afraid if anybody knew what the wood was for, they would face a backlash from the people in Dublin, because there was a lot of sympathy for the Invincibles at the time, it would seem. So the men would have had to come down here into the yard, and then the scaffold was in the middle, and they would have climbed up wooden steps. They would have been accompanied by their priest, Canon Kennedy, and the executions were witnessed by the governor and the sub-sheriff and other members of staff here in Kilmainham. And Marwood took a lot of pride in his skills as a hangman, and in some ways you needed to have somebody who was very skilled. So when the men came in here, when they got up onto the scaffold, he would have pinioned their legs together, and the reason they pinioned their arms and legs was basically to stop them flailing about when they were hanged. And as I said, Marwood prided himself on his professionalism, and insofar as a hanging can go well, they all seem to have gone well except for Thomas Caffrey's. Something went wrong, the drop went wrong. Your aim when executing someone apparently was to have the force of the man falling through the trapdoor to be so strong that it breaks their spinal cord and they die essentially immediately. With Caffrey, unfortunately, Marwood seemed to have got the ratio of his weight to the drop down through the trapdoor of the scaffold wrong, and Caffrey essentially asphyxiated, so he was essentially strangled, which is an awful way to die. Once the man was hanged, a black flag was raised over on the eastern end of the jail. You can't quite see it here, but it would have been up on the roof of the east wing. And then the men would have been inspected here in the yard by the coroner. We are going to have a bit of an epilogue about what happened afterwards, but I suppose while we are in this area, of course, we should mention the fact that this is where the men were buried and are still buried. That was part of the punishment. Part of the punishment of execution was that you were buried in prison. They're not the only people buried here. We know that there were at least probably 7 executions in Kilmainham after them, some of them on the same scaffold, some of them in the new hang house that we visited on one of the other videos, and they are presumably all buried here as well. We don't know exactly where. But what's really interesting is that many of the political prisoners after that were very taken with the fact that they were in the place where not only the Invincibles had been executed, but also buried. A lot of the women in particular during the Civil War talk about that this sense of awe that they had, that they were here in Kilmainham Gaol, which was so famous because in terms of their childhood, certainly the stories of the Invincibles. And it's kind of interesting to imagine them here now at the very heart of what the press described in 1966 as a national shrine. So it's kind of interesting that this is where they found their final resting place. Okay, our next video is going to look at the aftermath of these executions, and in particular what happened to James Carey, the man who betrayed his comrades to save himself. And that's also another kind of fascinating twist in this very remarkable story of the Invincibles in 1883.